study session of the City Council. Agendas for study sessions, including concept reviews, can be found visiting Broomfield's website at broomfield.org. Our agenda this evening includes one study session item, which will be televised on Channel 8 and through live video streaming on Broomfield's website. Council members are attending this study session remotely by video conference. The study session item in this evening is an update and conversation regarding Broomfield's proposed debt policy, overview of existing debt, and Windy Gap financing options. Council members have a copy of the agenda memorandum for this proposal, which I will ask our staff to summarize.
Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem and Council. Staff is excited to bring this to you tonight. This is the culmination of many months worth of work and the first conversation of many with regards to Windy Gap, simply the largest in our history and probably forever, a gap debt policy discussion that we will have specific to Windy Gap, as well as an overview of where our other debt, our general sales tax debt, is right now, possibilities for refinancing, sewer and water, given that those are two separate funding pots, two separate funding structures. We do have with us tonight Tom Wendelin from RBC. He's been instrumental in assisting us on this journey to collect a wide variety of data for your discussion tonight and final decisions with regards to financing options. You know, in the past, we have always made the decision to go into group financing. As we walked into this, not only this topic, but kind of the overarching, we took the same approach that we have for the last year, which is a comprehensive look how each one of these pieces fits. And so you all are well versed by now that from a totality of income, revenue, and expenses, provide us with what we're going to look like into the future. So this is a sustainable approach. It's a conservative approach. And for all of our bond conversations, we're fortunate enough to have Butler Snow, and they are also joining us tonight for specific questions and with regards to what's next. Brenda Ritchie, our Chief Financial Officer, and David Allen, our Assistant City County Manager, have really taken the reins on this and will be doing the bulk of the presentation tonight, beginning with Brenda Ritchie. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brenda. We did not want tonight to be rushed. There's a lot of information. We've sent some preliminary information for your review about a week and a half ago. And then again, we're following on the schedule of getting agendas out a full week in advance as well. We're hoping that assists in the conversation tonight. I'd like to turn it over to Brenda, who will walk us through this item, and then turn it over to David when the slides are appropriate. Brenda.
Perfect. Thank you, City Manager Hoffman. Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem, members of council and staff. As Ms. Hoffman indicated, we are continuing towards a shift in thinking regarding Broomfield's build out, really to ensure our decisions are based, as Ms. Hoffman indicated, on a sustainable fiscal foundation. And you'll probably hear that reiterated throughout the presentation this evening, because it's really important that all of Broomfield's policies are in alignment and that we remain dynamic in our approach. And as we see on slide 2, please, the agenda of what we're going to be reviewing, the debt policy, refinancing our existing debt, and walking through. Next slide, please. So, which is why when we started over a year ago in revamping our strategy approach to our various policies and guidance documents, we began to build a structure to move away from development paying its own way based on stagnant information, really more towards a comprehensive understanding by making thoughtful decisions of integrating all of the resources available and continuously evaluating and updating the data to really drive those decisions. It will ultimately pave the pathway and foundation, not only for Broomfield's build out, but also for future redevelopment. This all ties back to reviewing where we are, what we owe, and the timing to execute any potential refinancing, as well as bonding opportunities to fund that development, which leads us to tonight's conversation that City Manager Hoffman kicked us off with this evening on how Broomfield approaches financing its projects, and it all starts with the debt policy. Next slide, please. So while Broomfield has historically taken a pay-as-you-go approach to funding its projects, there's not been a definitive guidance to really assist staff, or the council for that matter, on when a debt issuance may be a better option to undertake. Therefore, staff, along with the support of our financial advisor, RBC Capital Markets, we drafted this debt policy to really outline applicable uses of debt and control measures to help mitigate financial risk to Broomfield. The policy not only provides guidance for the issuance of bonds and other forms of debt to finance, whether it be land acquisition, construction, equipment, and other capital requirements of Broomfield, but really a debt policy also preserves the city's credit strength. It provides the necessary flexibility to really fund those future capital needs. The amount of debt Broomfield issues is an important factor in measuring its financial well-being. And with the proper use and management through that debt policy, it can really yield significant fiscal benefits. Issuing debt also obligates Broomfield to long-term, so it can have a significant impact on our financial condition for an extended period of time and limit the funding available for changing service priorities, which is why a formal debt policy is so important. Next slide, please. So under the authority of the council, the city manager and staff can execute various debt instruments, oversee the accounting and reporting of debt, administer and manage any regulatory requirements related to those issuances. Because debt is typically used to finance capital improvements and never to support current operations, our debt policy takes into consideration and really outlines those instances when debt could, or maybe even when it shouldn't be issued, refunded, or refinanced. For example, you've got ideal market conditions similar to what we are seeing now with low interest rates could be a possible opportunity for Broomfield to evaluate if a refinance or debt issuance is appropriate. Other considerations would be low construction costs or if the useful life of a project or asset is greater than 5 years. As we look ahead this evening into the upcoming conversations with council regarding each of Broomfield's current debt, we'll outline those favorable conditions. If you think in terms of refinancing a home mortgage, for example, there are several considerations that need to be taken into account for it to make really financial sense. On the flip side, there are going to be situations where cash funding or the pay-as-you-go or use approach is more ideal. In those instances, we would expect the project could be funded from available current reserves or revenues that have a shorter term. Next slide, please. The other aspect of our debt policy is outlined by the Government Finance Officers Association, and Broomfield's own charter really includes the types of debt and structure, which could include short-term notes used for temporary issuances, and those are typically within the same calendar year, for example. The purpose of a really well-written debt management policy is to articulate Broomfield's goals with respect to debt and really enhance the council's ability to make those decisions on issuing debt and entering into those debt obligations. So it also exhibits our commitment to a long-term financial planning that ensures sound fiscal judgment and financial stability. And this formal debt policy is just another tool that's used to demonstrate our commitment to meet the debt obligations, and it's really favored among those rating agencies and lenders. It's not unlike the factors that could be used when calculating personal credit score, for example. With all of these aspects, staff along with RBC has drafted the foundation of how Broomfield may pursue financing options. And much like the plans council has already seen in the economic vitality matrix of the long-range financial plan, the debt policy intends to be reviewed and updated as needed based on the changing landscape, making it a flexible document. This policy really helps to outline and distinguish the capacity at which Broomfield can borrow and is governed by federal and state regulations really to limit what is reasonable and affordable. The overall goal of any debt incurred does not exceed the useful life of whatever is being funded. I mentioned that this policy will be updated as the overall management of Broomfield's debt continues to be monitored, and that's part of our annual budget process, as well as when opportunities arise to take advantage of possible lower interest rates or overall repayment options. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the various debt that Broomfield currently maintains and its existing obligations and those potential opportunities. Next slide, please. As you may recall from our study session in April, there are three main categories of debt issuances for Broomfield and the Urban Renewal Authority. This graphic really helps to not only outline those categories, but also reinforces the distinction between the various funding sources. For example, the general obligation bonds are primarily secured and pledged through tax revenues, with the examples such as the Broomfield Community Center and Dillon Road bonds, while certificates of participations or COPs reflect a lease purchase type of agreement, such as the Dissension Center. These are monies that really come from the operations and not taxes, but are still general fund, while the enterprise bonds for sewer and water are from recurring revenues from charges for use and tap fees. And it remains independent from the general fund, much like our capital improvement program, those project budgets where the funding revenue can't be commingled. Up next, we'll take a deeper dive into each of these categories for Broomfield. Next slide, please. Now, as we start with our certificate of participation issuances, you'll recall that we have two issuances, which are supported by the general fund. Due to the proximity of the debt ending and the structure, there's really not an opportunity for refinancing these leases. If Broomfield were to take on additional COPs prior to the term date, then these could possibly be included as part of a restructure. But as it currently stands and the principal pays down, Broomfield can release the collateral behind these COPs and own the facilities free and clear. Next slide. So here we observe the sales and use tax bonds that were established to refund the Flatirons debt obligation, and also the new bonds that were issued to support Dillon Road and the Community Center. These bonds do have the opportunity to be refinanced, and the first consideration is next year in 2022 with the Flatirons, and then a few years later with the 2017 bonds. Both of these bonds have been established in a reserve fund to help offset any shortfall or changes in revenue related to the sales and use tax. The debt coverage ratio on this slide also includes both a certificate of participation and sales tax bonds. And as you can see, there are sufficient anticipated revenues to cover these debt obligations. Next slide, please. So this slide demonstrates the various options available to refinance the sales tax revenue bonds for the Flatirons, should the council choose so, based on the current interest rates. Keep in mind that the earliest Broomfield could go to market would be in the fall of 2022. Next slide, please. So next is just a reminder of the outstanding 2005 Borough bonds that were issued for the First Bank Center and are backed by a letter of credit. If you recall, these bonds are currently issued under a variable rate, meaning that it can change at any time and have the ability to be refinanced at any time as well. And as we move forward with our discussions with the council on debt obligations, we'll evaluate all financing opportunities related to these bonds and plan to revisit the Borough bond options in the fall of this year. The bonds are really paid from tax increment revenue, and that's specific to the urban renewal area. So while Borough has started to see some of the revenue generated with the additional development in this area, the letter of credit really guarantees any shortfall due to insufficient revenue coming in. So staff will continue to monitor and provide council updates and options for refinancing specific to Borough. Next slide, please. So as we move into our enterprise bonds, this should all look pretty familiar from our April conversation, starting with the sewer and wastewater bonds. We also have the opportunity to refinance this outstanding debt, similar to sales.
Hey, Brenda.
Yep.
I'm going to interrupt you just for one moment and kind of get council's gauge on if you would like us to move through all of this, or if before we go onto the sewer bonds, if you have questions, would you like to chunk the questions, or do you prefer us to move all the way through? Is there a preference? No? Okay. Councilmember Law Evans, I saw your hand up.
Yes, exactly. I do have a question on the Borough debt with regards to the First Bank Center. Because that's been kind of a sore spot for some time, with me anyway, and I suspect with other members of the public as well. I'm not suggesting this, but what that asset does not come anywhere near close to paying for itself. What options other than refinance do we have to get out from under that debt or modify that debt? Do we have any options? I realize
Brenda,
that's a
I'm
part
gonna-
of the conversation too, so my apologies on that. I'm just looking for a quick answer here.
I'm going to take the first shot at it, and that is, we are in conversation right now. So the contract is up. We're in conversation with them now about extending it out a little further after we do a CapEx review. So we need to know how much more money we're going to be putting in. But at this point right now, if we didn't have an operator, between the bond debt, Brenda, what is that amount annually? 800,000?
Thereabouts. It ranges, so it's going to range on the interest rates on an annual basis. So this year, it's about 4 million, right? And so on this slide, it shows what our debt service balance is. So that column of debt service is what it will go to 10 million in 2030. So right now we're paying approximately 4 million in annual payments of debt service.
And what is the revenue that we are getting from Keek?
Roughly, given on a good year, it would be anywhere from 200 to 400,000, but our costs are 800,000 in what we're expending. I believe that's what you're getting at.
So,
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Jennifer, go ahead.
That's all right. I was just gonna, so there's a lot more conversations. It's a difficult building. It's hard to repurpose. It's very expensive. So we're continuing those conversations, Councilmember Law Evans, and we'll be back to you with a much deeper dive on the borough bonds.
I appreciate that. And the last comment I'll make, just for the benefit of my colleagues, and I perhaps I can be forgiven for phrasing it this way, since I am beginning to be very, very lame in the lame duck tradition, and that is, my preference would be to have our debt policy have some sort of a statement in it like, don't do really stupid things, which in my opinion, the First Bank Center is. Do things that make sense, think about them hard, don't do stupid stuff. And that's what that was. So again, my apologies if my language is a little crude there, but I feel pretty strongly about this. And that comment is for the rest of my colleagues who will presumably be continuing on in some form or fashion on council. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Did anybody else want to ask questions or comment, or should we keep moving? Raise your hand if you do.
I did. Oh, there we go.
Oh, go ahead, Councilmember Groom.
Thank you very much. On page 11, I did want to go back to that refinancing slide. Talk to me about the refinancing today versus wait and refinance in September. Why did we have those two analysis? Why would we wait?
Sure.
That's callable, or?
So the bonds are callable in December of 2022 is when they're callable. It was just what the option would be as a status, as a baseline for refinancing today, what it would look like at current interest rates. And then should it move so many basis points, meaning the percentage points, if it would increase by a certain percentage point and interest rates would increase, then that's the average rate and repayment that we would be looking at. And I could certainly turn it over to Tom Wendelin to help further expand that. But basically, this is to establish a baseline of what's the taxable. So we've got taxable and tax exempt refunding. So it's split into two, and what that would look like based on today's market rate. And then should things change come September and December of 2022, because the bonds are not callable until then, we anticipate there could be some changes to the market, but not significant changes at this point. Obviously, we don't know what the market will do. It could very well change drastically, but we don't anticipate that based on current market conditions and forecasts. I'm not sure if Mr. Wendelin would like to add anything related to this slide.
Let me get my video up here. The top part of that really is, since we can't call them till 2022, if you try to refinance them today, you're really having two bond issues out at the same time. You have your old ones out until 2022, and then you'll have your new ones, the refinancing ones out starting right now. And so interest rates are really low. And so having two bond issues out at the same time costs you something. But are you saving enough by doing it today, given how low rates are, to basically have two issues out at the same time for a year? So that's the top part of this. And the only thing we can do prior to 90 days of the 2022 call date is either do them as a taxable bond, a convertible bond that's taxable until 2022 and then converts to tax exempt. And then another one is just say, find some buyer that says, I'll take these bonds in 2022 at some rate. Kind of, I'll deliver those to you later, but we guarantee a rate today. And then the real baseline is, if we're just going to, and so those are your options today. And if I just said, well, okay, and what if we just do and wait until 90 days before the call date? What would be the savings difference if rates stayed the same from now until 2022? Right now, as we look at it, and we'll just look at dollar savings, and we'll pick the best one from the top, which is roughly $3.5 million. If we just waited, it's almost worth $6.3 million as long as rates stay the same. If rates, even when we get to December 2022, are up 0.25%, it's $5.5 million. 0.5%, you're at $5 million. Really, rates would have to move up somewhere between 0.75% and 1% from now until September of 2022 to kind of to say I would do the same. I would actually do this forward taxable refunding today, tax exempt refunding today, and end up at the same place.
To be at the same place. I get
right.
it. Yeah. Thank you.
And so rates could move up, but I can just tell you that tax exempt rates moving up 1% because there's a tax advantage to them, right? And so roughly, obviously taxes are going to increase probably too. So that's more than 1% if you put it on a taxable equivalent after someone would have to pay taxes. So it's closer to 1.25% probably, but it's trying to just say, sometimes you'll get these things, people say you can save money today. And if we thought rates were going to move up a ton and we could foresee that, it might make sense to do something today. But you should know the sensitivities of how much the rates really have to move for us to have been better off just to sit around and wait, or do it today is really the differential.
Thank you. I couldn't figure out why we would analyze the refinancing today when they weren't due until 2022, but now I understand the table. So thank you very much. And that
I mean, they're done quite often. They've been done quite often for a long time. And it really has to do with you issued them a really high interest rate and rates are really low. Even though I'm going to have two issues out at the same time, I'm going to save a lot of money. I'm willing to take that money today. You'll have to wait till the future to figure out if you made the right choice or not. But if you can lock in savings today and if it's reasonable, then usually people, say, sure, let's do that. And usually have some threshold for that as a percentage. And in the debt policy, it's drafted as 5%. Really, if you look at the top ones, really the only two that really go over that are, the convertible or the forward. That even kind of meet that percentage minimum threshold.
Got it. Thank you very much. I appreciate that explanation.
Sure.
Thank you.
Councilmember Schaaf.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So I'll take this opportunity to ask a kind of a more general question. So one of the first statements, Ms. Ritchie, that you made was, moving away from the development paying for itself and moving to more of a comprehensive approach. Since I've been on council and even before then, I've always heard that in Broomfield, development pays for itself. So how can we be moving away from this, and why is it a good idea?
Sure, it's a great question. Excuse me, Councilmember Schaaf. So we're just seeing, when we pencil out the numbers of development coming in, of what the expenditures going out, whether that be in a development agreements, in reduction in our sales tax revenue, that sort of aspect, or calculating the increased costs of development. When we see that return on investment, it's not penciling out the same. So we're looking more towards a hybrid approach in order to really, and not stagnant. And by that, I mean, so historically, for example, the long range financial plan, the utility rate model, two prime examples that were last done in 2012, rather than continuously looking at them on an annual basis. So taking those types of policies and guidance documents to be able to set the foundation, really take current data to be able to drive those decisions and say, now that the time is right, the market's ripe for whether that's a refinancing, there's opportunities that exist, and making sure that we have enough cash. Are there cash reserves to fund it, or does it make better sense to actually fund it over a long term? Is that useful life better to be financed through a debt obligation versus a pay-as-you-go type of obligation? Does that kind of?
And Brenda,
yep.
Brenda, if I may, just quickly, Councilmember Schaaf, the dynamic approach. So where we were 10 years ago as a community, when we had 75% still build out, your reliance on any one, we didn't have a diversification, in other words. So now, for the first time ever, in Broomfield, we have infill, we have redevelopment, and we have continuing new development. In fact, our three projects, our big projects, Baseline, continuing to be a new development, Broomfield Town Square, infill, and then redevelopment in Flatirons. Anytime that you do not have a dynamic modeling or a multi-pronged approach for financing, you are going to then become heavily reliant on one, even as it dissipates. So the way that we think about it from an economic vitality, long-range financial plan, sustainable long-term plan, is if you continue to think about the one-time hits. So for example, tap fees, being so reliant on those. Tap fees are a one-time get you in the door hit. Development agreements, when they have, whether it's the tax increment financing or any of those other financing, anytime that they're paying one time for that, it's an entry fee. It's an entry fee into our community. But the maintenance component of it, or the handoff to us, is not included in that. So again, it's that diversification methodology that will now get us through build out. So it was that term in and of itself, from a long-term perspective, has never been viable.
Great.
And we asked that question a lot, Councilmember Schaaf. So I'm really glad you asked that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the understanding that makes a lot of sense. The idea that a one-time fee isn't necessarily going to cover those maintenance fees. Kind of spending a lot of time lately in transportation. You can build a road and it costs $10 million, but that doesn't necessarily take into account 5-10 years down the road when you have to maintain that road. So there are expenses that go above and beyond. So it is good to understand this. And I think that having that hybrid approach makes a lot of sense. I think that those are my questions for now. Thank you.
Councilmember Lim.
Yes, if you want to tell me to wait on this till we get to Flatiron redevelopment or something else, let me know. But this is the question that pops in my mind. So when I am not familiar with the refunding of Flatirons, that was in, I guess, 2012. So what is the background to that, and how does the outstanding nature of that debt impact what's coming before us and what we're going to see in the development plans? And like I said, if you want to say, wait, we'll get to that later, that's fine.
I'm gonna say both. We will get to a much broader conversation later. But part of having a debt policy that is in place that is dynamic will preclude decisions to refinance until council fully understands what the short-term and long-term ramifications of that refinance are. It also is incumbent upon us to continually be reevaluating this debt annually, and not looking at that snapshot from 2012. Having that refinance absolutely impacts what we're able to do and for the developer, right? Because it's a new developer that's coming in, and that developer has to deal with that outstanding debt and what that repayment piece looks like for us. So none of these are a moneymaker. Baseline is not a moneymaker for us. Broomfield Town Square will not be a moneymaker for us. Flatirons will certainly not be a moneymaker for us. So when we have that outstanding layered debt, it impacts what that long-term and short-term business development agreement looks like. So we're zeroing in on that goal by early fall. Councilmember Lim, we're coming back on that Flatirons redevelopment, but you're absolutely right. Those conversations about what that outstanding debt looks like and what that refinance capability looks like. But again, refinance, when we think of our homes, right? A lot of folks get really excited to refinance and then they pull the money out instead of leaving the equity in. And then that was the case with that refinance. So it's either pay now or pay later, and someone pays. So a much broader conversation to come on that. And again, it's a fascinating real learning experience for all of you, because you have three very unique developments that are occurring, each with individual unique sets of financing, all of which will include bond debt.
Okay, thank you. I'll wait for more in the fall. Thanks.
Councilmember Schaaf, did you raise your hand again? Or did I forget to put it down?
No, I did raise my hand again. Councilmember Lim reminded me of another question that I had at this point. So, looking at that debt policy overview, I really think that this is great. And I'm curious, with the existing debt that we have, does that existing debt meet kind of the criteria that's set forth with this debt policy? Or if we were to have this debt policy in place before we had started borrowing that money, would we have made different decisions?
That's a really great. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, Brenda, I was just smiling because that was one of our very first questions. Go ahead, Brenda, please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That came into the framework of how we were designing the debt policy, because we wanted to make sure, so yes, it does meet the test. To answer your question directly, it does meet the test of being able to be within our, meet the criteria of our debt policy, but it also allows us, as we move forward for future obligations, to be able to really evaluate and look at those obligations and say, does it still make sense? Because as City Manager Hoffman just indicated, what we did 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, looks very different. The market conditions, the economy, just the way in which Broomfield has expanded and grown in the last 5 years exponentially has caused a lot of shifts. And so with that, we need to be able to move forward with that dynamic model, having a framework of policy that has fundamental criteria. It also aligns with, we made sure that it aligned with our Broomfield charter, because within the charter, there are provisions related to issuances of debt, as well as the Government Finance Officers Association, the GFOA. We put that through the rigors of a lot of our documents. So same with our comprehensive annual financial report that you all will be seeing on June 15th, as well as our budget documents, our annual budget documents, we make sure that there's a threshold and a criteria that's a standard within the industry. And so we make sure that that is met as well. So that criteria is baked within the policy to ensure that, existing debt meets that, as well as potential future debt, but allows the flexibility to be fluid and agile as we move forward and the market changes, or our needs as an organization and community changes as well. So to answer your question, yes, existing debt was taken into consideration in the framework of establishing the current debt policy.
Right. I guess I want to make sure my question was clear, because what you just said was that it was taken into account, because I would hope that it would be taken into account when we're developing a debt policy. But if we had had this debt policy in place before we went ahead and pulled that debt of previous, would we have done that? Would we have made that decision?
Sure. So all of the debt that was previously issued at the time met those conditions for that time. So, it may be a different story if we were issuing that debt today. Say the sewer bonds we were issuing in today's market, would we structure it a little differently? That's the possibility. But how it was done when we issued it in 2002, very different conditions. So it would meet that criteria based on useful life, what made sense. We had the cash reserve, or we didn't have that flexibility. So we needed to go. Same with the bond structure for bonding the BCC and Dillon Road. At the time, that's what made sense in order to, based on the market and based on those conditions. So going forward. But again, that's why the debt policy, the way it's structured, allows for opportunities for refinance should things change. But yes, the existing debt at the time of the issuance, for whatever year it was, 2012 for the water bonds, for example, or 2002, at that time, it would have made sense. But that's why we have the ability to reevaluate as we move forward.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Schaaf, if I may add just real quickly, applying it then, it's the philosophical approach that changes, right? So the debt would have been issued within all of those other parameters that Brenda mentioned, but really it's the conversation about the bigger, larger picture of sustainability. So these are new conversations about what's next, what's there. That's the lens, through that lens. So I think the lens is different. The technicalities of assuming it will be the same and would be the same. For example, the recommendations for increasing the rates. There is, so not having an arbitrary nature of, are we going to introduce a rate increase that's been recommended this year or not? So again, it takes it out of any whether I'm the city manager or whether you all are the same council, or Brenda's in her role. What we're trying to put in place is a structure that will outlive any one particular person or philosophical approach. That's the structure that we're trying to put in place right now, so that the filter remains consistent regardless of the philosophical approach of increase or not to increase, which makes a difference. And it makes a difference where we are right now because of the decision not to increase. Does that make sense, Councilmember Schaaf?
It does. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just have a quick, point of clarification. So we're being asked to decide whether or not to wait and issue tax-exempt refinancing bonds in September through December of 2022. Is that the advice of our consultant, Brenda, to wait and monitor?
That's correct, Mayor Pro Tem. We're currently, because they're not callable until next fall, so we would continue to evaluate and watch the market conditions and just make sure that we have all of the information and do our due diligence before making a recommendation to council. As we get closer to that time, we will have all of that data, but in the conversations leading up to, we'll certainly lay out what those options look like, and based on, again, to Councilmember Groom's point earlier, what those current rates are versus what those changes would be in the future. So, but that is the recommendation at this time, to currently wait on before proceeding with any type of refinancing.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ritchie. Are there any other questions or comments before we keep moving?
Mayor Pro Tem, I just want, so before we get to the Windy Gap debt, staff wanted to provide an overview of all things that had debt even attached, so that when we ask, as we continue to have this narrative about the funding for Windy Gap, you all have a totality of what we're asking for, what the impacts are, and the sustainable nature of what that specific ask is by the end of tonight, as we go into next week, which is the individual group financing. So we're narrowing it down. So we wanted to start wide and then narrow it down.
Then proceed.
Great. I think we're, speaking of moving, right before we move into the Windy Gap is on slide, so we've moved from the sewer bonds into the payoff of the water bonds. So that's our last enterprise fund on slide 15. And so these bonds were issued in 2012 to refinance that 2002 debt. And you can see here that they're set to be paid in full by next year. Staff is recommending the early payment of these bonds based on two main factors. So the first being that Broomfield has the revenue stream to pay off the bonds, and second, that the upcoming Windy Gap financing, it makes financial sense to start with a clean slate, if you will, and not combine this debt with the new obligations. So that being said, next slide, please. I'll turn it over to Assistant City County Manager David Allen to walk us through the overview related to the Windy Gap financing. David?
Thank you, Ms. Ritchie, and good evening, Mayor Pro Tem and City Council members. Before I did get into the Windy Gap financing overview, I did want to put out a quick plug for our water tour that is going to be on July 31st. It's a Saturday, and it's a pretty much all-day tour. I did have a couple of council members already respond and are planning to attend that tour, but I just wanted to go ahead and announce that one last time. If you are interested in participating in that tour, please reach out to me and let me know that you would like to attend that. In addition to city staff, we'll also have staff from Northern Water participating in that tour and providing an overview of both the Northern Water, Colorado Big Thompson facilities, as well as the Windy Gap project on the Colorado River. And the tour will generally end, or typically ends, with a visit to the proposed Windy Gap firming project site, which is going to be named the Chimney Hollow Reservoir site. So again, if you can get back to me, that would be great. So if we can go to the next slide. The Windy Gap project has been a project that has been in the works for many, many years. Broomfield, along with 11 other participants, started the planning process for the Windy Gap firming project over 20 years ago. And for Broomfield, it's going to provide 5,600 acre-feet of reliable water supply. This supply will meet our needs through build-out. And again, it's an investment in our future, in our ability to serve the growth that we are anticipating, not only in the Northeast area, but then in other areas, as Ms. Hoffman had mentioned, as it relates to infill projects as well as redevelopment projects throughout the community. As we look at the value of water, one thing I did want to point out is that we purchased Colorado Big Thompson shares back in 2016. We purchased 734 Big Thompson shares, and the average cost of those shares was $26,400 per share. As we fast forward 5 years and look at current rates, those same shares are now selling for $65,000 a share. And if we were to take that cost and kind of translate that to the value of the Windy Gap project and looking at replacing that full 5,600 acre feet, we would be looking at an investment of over $500 million to replace that same water supply. So as Ms. Hoffman had mentioned earlier, this is a significant decision for this City Council in terms of the magnitude of the debt issuance. But as you look at it in a bigger, broader sense, it is truly an investment in our future and our ability to serve the community through build out. Next slide, please. So again, just to kind of recap in terms of the activities that we've been participating in that is leading up to this point, a lot of this was initiated through the City Council's approval of the allotment contract in October of last year. And again, the allotment contract establishes kind of the rights and responsibilities of all the different participants. It allocates the storage amounts that each participant will have in the Chimney Hollow Reservoir project, as well as allocating the costs, both the initial capital costs as well as the ongoing operation and maintenance costs that are going to be associated with the project. That action was followed up with staff's hiring of a financial advisor to take a look at our debt policy. And that debt policy or that evaluation included an analysis of our current existing financial health, as well as our ability to refund and refinance existing debt. A lot of this information was presented to Council at the April 20th study session, and the conversations that were leading up to that point was particularly as it pertained to Windy Gap, is that we were leaning towards independent financing. When we first executed the allotment contract with Northern Water, we had held as a placeholder that we would participate in group financing. However, we're not obligated to stay with that, and we still have the option to change. And again, that was primarily a placeholder, and based on the results of the analysis from our financial consultant, as well as additional studies from our own staff, we are leaning towards moving toward an independent debt finance as opposed to participating in the group financing with the other participants. 2 days after that study session, we had the Windy Gap lawsuit settlement, which then has put us into a position where now we're ready to move forward with construction of the project, and why it's imperative that we finalize our method of payment for the Windy Gap project. I do also want to mention on April 27th, we issued a request for proposals to complete a utility rate study. And again, this rate study is supporting our sustainable long-term comprehensive approach to how we finance not only large capital projects such as the Windy Gap project, but also how we finance and continue to operate and maintain the system on a regular and normal basis. And those are the costs that are associated with treatment, repairs, asset replacement, and those types of things. And the important part of this study, again, will be to look at a comprehensive approach that takes into consideration that as we continue to approach build out, our opportunities to rely on license fees and tap fees to fund new capital projects are going to continue to diminish. And we need to be ahead of that and implement changes well in advance of that. And so this rate study that we are embarking in this year will help set us up for those future conversations and preparing us for that flexibility and that diversity on a long-term basis. And then most recently, 3 weeks ago, City Council approved a $2 million payment for the Windy Gap project. And we also had conversations regarding a revised debt approach for our participation in the Windy Gap project. Next slide, please. So staff is recommending independent financing for 3 reasons in terms of the Windy Gap project. First is the reduced financial liability. We've had conversations about taking on additional liability if we participate in the group financing, where if another participant does not meet their obligations, then we would essentially be a co-signer on that loan and would need to pick up their share of the costs, and then we would acquire asset that we don't necessarily need to meet our long-term projections. Secondly, we have greater financial autonomy. We can choose to potentially refinance in the future if we need to. And if we participate in the pooled financing, that decision is left with the broader group in the larger group, and there may not be a decision to do so. And this is currently what we're looking at with potentially refinancing both our sales and use tax as well as our sewer bonds in terms of the opportunity to be able to restructure those when it's fiscally beneficial for us to do so. In addition, we also have a greater flexibility in our payment schedule. We could potentially pay off some of this debt sooner if we get a lot more growth than we anticipate in the upcoming years. And then that will essentially shorten the term of our debt service, which if we participated in the group financing, we wouldn't have that opportunity. And lastly, we have potentially lower costs with the debt issuance. As we continue to move forward, one of the next steps that we have is to complete a rating study, a rating analysis for our water fund. And if the rating comes out, comparable to where the group financing is, we would certainly have a less debt service or less interest payments because we're looking at a term that would be potentially less than the 30 years that the group financing is pursuing in. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. At this point, I'd like to turn it back to Ms. Ritchie to kind of go over some of the different options that we were looking at for funding and financing the Windy Gap debt. And then she'll also conclude with kind of the next steps in terms of the timeline for that debt issuance, as well as looking at the other non-Windy Gap debt issuances as we continue to look ahead at refinancing the outstanding sewer bonds and then the use and sales tax.
Thanks, David. If we can move to the next slide, please. So as Mr. Allen mentioned, and he outlined it perfectly, and with the assistance of RBC, we were able to develop some possible scenarios and funding of our future water investment, because it truly is an investment. And this slide, in slide 20, breaks down the various interest rates and the cost of issuance on a 20, 25, and 30-year timeframe of independent financing. So what it's doing is taking our source of funds, our revenues, if you will, and then what it's used for in terms of, and you'll notice that we had mentioned paying off those 2012 water bonds, so that's there as well. In addition, and that's going to be used from the already projected reserve, as well as the set aside payments that we have built into our capital plan, along with the project fund, so the $155 million. And down below is the current estimated interest rates for those various years. And you can see the difference in that bottom line of the total uses of funds regarding that independent financing. If we go to the next slide, please. And this is a breakdown of the debt service coverage ratio, which if you recall from our long-range financial plan is very similar in how we determine the anticipated revenues as compared to our outgoing expenditures to provide us with a confidence level of being able to adequately repay that debt. So again, we're looking at a 20, 25, 30-year time frame. And Tom of RBC has been able to confirm staff's projection that based on the cash revenue pro forma for the water and interest rates, the city is positioned to adequately cover this debt. Another confirmation is that in our annual budgeting process, where the debt payment coverages are programmed into our capital improvement plan, staying in line with our fiscally conservative practices, staff is currently programmed debt repayment at a much higher interest rate, which allows for flexibility should the market conditions change, or as Mr. Allen mentioned, we have the opportunity to maybe refinance or do something different with that independent financing. Next slide, please. So for all of the reasons that were previously mentioned this evening, staff is recommending under the guidance of RBC to pursue independent financing related to that $177 million Windy Gap debt. Keep in mind that the $20 million has already been earmarked for cash funding, and Broomfield would finance roughly $157 million. This allows Broomfield to really retain that control that Mr. Allen mentioned of the financing and potential refinance at a later date if it's favorable to do so. The burning question, I'm sure, is how is Broomfield going to pay for this investment? RBC has already begun having discussions with the rating agencies to allow for Broomfield to be in the best position Tom and his team continue to analyze Broomfield's various plans, and such as the long-range financial plan and our capital improvement projects. That's because it gives us a 20-year outlook, and it really confirms the projected income and revenue to support that projected debt with the recurring charges, and then eventually those annual fees and the recurring charges. So as staff has already programmed in those repayments in our future forecasts as we balance the annual budget. Another aspect of funding is implementing the recommendations within the utility rate study to really solidify and establish that future funding supports the system. Those necessary adjustments are what will make the debt issuance fiscally sound and sustainable. Next slide, please. So what does that mean as we move forward with a timeline perspective? And what can council expect to see related to Windy Gap? Well, next week, we'll come forward with 2 resolutions selecting the independent financing mechanism for Windy Gap and authorizing the city manager to pursue that debt. Then staff plans on hosting several conversations with council to further engage in those discussions around refinancing opportunities and answering questions council may have related specifically to Windy Gap. Staff is currently working with our bond counsel, Butler Snow, to provide council with the first reading of the debt ordinance at the beginning of July, and then close out with the physical tours Mr. Allen mentioned of the project. Staff and bond counsel anticipate that a second reading for the debt can occur in August. Next slide, please. So similarly, from a non-Windy Gap perspective, there are other financial conversations that council can expect in the coming months. Next Tuesday, council will have the opportunity to formally adopt the debt policy previewed tonight and that you received last week. And then we'll walk through Broomfield's overall financial health with our independent auditors, Reuben Brown, regarding the 2020 financial audit and review our comprehensive annual financial report. Staff also anticipates that we'll continue the dialogue around the refinancing existing debt prior to the mentioned call dates. So that would include, Councilmember Lim, your question about the Flatirons Mall and that redevelopment and how that ties in to the upcoming conversations. And I know while it's probably been an overwhelming amount of financial information, I'll just close by saying that the work that management, staff, and our various partners have completed really sets the foundation for establishing clear and consistent debt issuance practices, which are paramount to a successful bond issuance and the future financial performance and stability for Broomfield. With that, staff as well as Tom Wendelin from RBC and members of our bond council Butler Snow are available to answer any questions y'all might have tonight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen and Ms. Ritchie. Do any council members have any questions or comments? Councilmember Tessier.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So you showed us the advantages of going independent. Were there any cons that you had to consider in moving toward a more independent route for the financing for this?
So I'll start it, and then David and Brenda can fill in the gaps. I know that it's a big change in direction, Councilmember Tessier, and one that we didn't fall into. So again, there was some initial conversation that independent financing was just the only way to go. But we didn't take that approach. So we did a deep dive on both the pros and the cons, to your point. And we did not find a con in the independent financing other than the historical agreement with the other participants. They have been relying on us to do the group financing. So again, not only did we not take it lightly because of the amount of debt for Broomfield, but we want to continue to be solid partners with all of those participants. Again, their rates may look differently because we're going independent. Northern Water was a little concerned that others may follow suit and seek independent financing. Given that Broomfield Longmont has always, they are also securing independent financing. They were never part of the group financing. So that's been their plan all along. And so a lot of our preliminary conversations before making the recommendation to go independent, for all the reasons that were outlined, primarily to be kind of the masters of your own destiny. And if we wanted more water, then we would have purchased it on the front end, right? I mean, again, so the default of someone else, and everybody's a really great partner until they're not. So this doesn't have anything to do with the viability of any of those other communities. But when we looked at apples to apples, and the not just being independent, but being able to refinance it, being able to not be kind of in that pod of having to check in, with 11 other members before you took a step. And the financial viability of it was really something that we took into account. So again, the cons were those relationships that we wanted to continue to maintain and have a healthy response as to why we were changing after so long. David, did I miss anything?
No, I think I mean, there's probably two other minor things that I would point out. One is that, the Colorado Water Conservation Board had approved a $90 million subordinate debt loan to the project participants. Again, it was the state indicating its support for this project. And so with us going with the independent debt, we won't be able to participate in that. However, that's really not a significant loss because, again, the term of that loan is going to be for 30 years. And again, with our financial position, we really feel that we can have that debt paid off sooner. And so that's really not a loss. And then the only other one, again, might be related to issuance of debt. There are certain costs that we will incur because we're issuing debt on our own, whereas those costs would be shared with the other participants. However, but when you look at it from a broader perspective and giving up that autonomy and the flexibility, I think that those costs are very minor with us picking those up.
I don't know if Ms. Ritchie had anything to add.
No, David actually was able to hit on the other loan, the $90 million loan, was the only thing I was going to add. So thanks.
Cool. No, I really appreciate that. I appreciate the thoughtful approach. Yeah, we need water to survive, and we need to know that we'll have it secured. And if we can do that better on our own, then I think that's a smart approach. So I appreciate all the work that's gone in here. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Law Evans, did you want to comment?
Thank you. Well, I raised my hand and then I lowered it. Councilmember Tessier hit on what I was going to ask about, but I would just say thank you to staff for continuing to work on this. And I know that I, for one, had some pointed questions at the last study session, and I think all my questions have been answered. This is, honestly, it's scary and exciting at the same time. So I appreciate staff's hard work, and I'm looking forward to this water. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Henkel.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I have two questions. The first is, I do support, staff's direction, and I love how it's sort of all hands on deck, and it's everyone is just really involved in looking out for each other and for Broomfield, and I've really appreciated that approach. And I'm curious, my first question is just, we're not going to be doing the group financing, but is there any other constraints that might put, sort of a wrench in this as far as being a part of this group, being a part of Windy Gap? Like, what are we really looking at as far as liability otherwise besides funding?
Councilmember Hinkle, I think that is the biggest liability that we have, particularly as we go through construction, is making sure that we get the funding in place to be able to move forward with construction. Once that's completed and the facility is in operation, I don't think that there's going to be any issues. And again, one of the benefits with Broomfield issuing its own debt is that once we transition into that operating mode, we won't have to rely on others having to make their payments and then us potentially covering for those payments if they're not made. And so again, I think that from a constraint standpoint, really shorter term, it's just really getting all of the funding in place to be able to move forward with construction.
Okay, and I bet the devil's in the details on that one soon too. My last question, and maybe we don't know the answer to this, but I'm looking forward to the utility rate study. Can anyone sort of help me flesh that out as far as like, what would that look like? Because I just want to make sure that we're very transparent with Broomfield residents from the get-go, and that's even including the process of the utility rate study.
Brenda, will you move through that timeline
Sure.
for council? Thank you.
Absolutely. So as Mr. Allen mentioned, in April, we issued the the request for proposal. I believe we received 5 responses. And so the evaluation team is in the process of finalizing that determination. So in the coming weeks, we'll be going through the evaluations and then calling back at 2 individual, the top 2 consultants for an interview. And so that's slated for the end of June. And we, yes, for the end of June. And so that we hope to have it issued, an award for the contract by no later than the end of June so they can get started on work. And based on the proposals, folks are looking at late to early winter time in terms of fall to be able to provide that utility rate study so we can come back to council. Our goal is to really dive in and provide that support because a lot of the legwork does come from staff as well to provide that the data and the background for the consultants to dive into to do their analysis. So we'll work in tandem with the chosen consultants and hope to, our goal is by September to really have something to council, but we'll just say the general fall is when, because we do not want to rush that. We want to make sure that we've gone through, it's done in such a way that we can really back up what proposals and recommendations that the rate study comes forward to council. And we'll have several conversations throughout that iteration, through that process with the council as well during study sessions to be able to walk through where we are with what we're seeing in terms of the rate study and those recommendations and what those potential adjustments may be.
Okay, and as those applications are coming in, is there sort of a philosophy that Broomfield is taking when choosing one of the consultants over the other, or what are you guys looking at?
So within the request for proposal, we outlined a scope of work and be happy to share that with the council so that you all can see what the criteria for the evaluation was. And so basically that's awarded on points. And then we also take into consideration 3 other additional elements. So a local factor, local preference. So if there is a presence within Colorado, also a sustainable factor. We've recently added that as well to our request for proposals to ensure that we have that as well as a social justice element. So ensuring that equity lens. So if the organization, that consultant has that, so we're trying to incorporate that and that's below the line, if you will. So they get awarded additional percentage points for that. And then we evaluate that. So I'll be happy to share that with the council with those criteria. So basically we go through each individual independent evaluator. We'll go through the proposals, score them, and then Broomfield awards on a best use, best value, if you will. It's not based on lowest price. So we ensure and we look at the total package, and that's how Broomfield awards. It's part of our procurement process.
Okay, great. I don't mean to get in the weeds, or I totally trust you all, and I, just really appreciate that process. But I also love transparency and telling people, how we're doing things, and I appreciate that philosophical approach. Thank you.
Councilmember Groom.
Thank you. Just super quick question. I'm sorry. I think I stepped away for a quick second on page or slide 21 when you were talking about the debt service coverage ratios. I did not hear, is that with tap fees or without tap fees? I'm assuming it's with tap fees.
That's correct, Councilmember Groom. It projects the anticipated tap fees as well as the recurring revenue from recurring charges as well. So all of our anticipated revenue is incorporated in that model.
So I can only assume that without tap fees, we are negative because the number with tap fees is 3.15, and then when you calculate it in, it's 1.45, and it before it was negative 0.4, so now we're probably -1. And I thought that was the number that was most important to the debt analysis people. So are we going to have any kind of backlash when the debt analysis looks at that without tap fees? Is that going to hinder Broomfield when they look at the ratio? Because I'm only assuming it's a very negative.
Brenda, I'm going to take a shot at this one. Councilmember Groom, thank you for that question, and it's a good one. And part of the conversations that we've had, not only with RBC, but also our bond counsel. And it kind of goes back to Councilmember Tessier's question, when just a full evaluation, a deep dive of the pros and cons of each approach, and then the common denominators, whether you went independent or group financing. And part of that conversation, of course, is, does the rate study have to come before the debt? Because the rate study showing, right? And the answer unequivocally was no, it doesn't. And so again, there's quantitative and then there's qualitative that Moody's takes into account when they're doing their ratios. So we are gathering the data right now. We will be paying about $30,000 for Moody's to run 3 confidential performas, if you will, based on 3 different scenarios. So first and foremost, we needed to know, because we certainly would not be advising moving forward if not having that rate study would have any type of negative impact, even remotely. So the answer was no. The quantitative piece is that, and Tom can speak a little bit more to this, but the fact that, again, we had another rate study that was done in 2012. It's the implementation piece. So the mere fact of having a rate study is not going to impact your rate. Implementing along the way, if you decide to refinance, would. So Tom had indicated new council, new leadership at the city county, new philosophy, and new approach. And we have documentation that indicates what that new approach is, and it's not the development pays for its own way. And so having the RFP issued and having a timeline in place suffices that they know that we're looking at applying what that outcome is differently. So we'll come back to council after those 3 confidential performances are done before we issue that debt with kind of those 3 separate examples. And I know that's a long explanation, but it's a more comprehensive answer than just, do we need to have the rate study before or after?
Yeah, and will they be doing any kind of like risk analysis? Because you know I love my risk analysis on the revenue, on our total revenue, because our charges for services, it's like 99% we're going to get that revenue. But our development fees, if you look across that development, if something happens to, let's say, Baseline, and they lose their financing, or Interlochen decides not to build, and all of a sudden in 1 year we lose 50% of a development because they stop building, we're going to lose those fees, and we're going to have to pay that revenue somehow. So I I wouldn't mind seeing what kind of risk we have, because that tap fee is 50% of our revenue. Well, mostly.
Right, which is, so I'm gonna have Brenda follow up on this, but Councilmember Groom, exactly that point. The diversification approach and not being so reliant on those tap fees. So the question is, does the diversification approach minimize the risk? And the answer is yes. But I'm gonna let the CFO, that was a layman's perspective. So Brenda, fill in the gaps for me here.
Absolutely, and I'll keep it at a layman's perspective in the fact that, two things. One being so think of it as, again, if we're refinancing a house mortgage, you're looking at all of your sources of income, right? So if you've got a bank account, you've got multiple bank accounts, and you have, in the same regard, we're looking at tap fees and recurring charges. So thinking of it in that bucket, if you will. So we're thinking about from that perspective. And then in terms of your risk analysis, that's absolutely done. It's that same methodology. It would try and figure out whether or not we have the capacity if something were to shift. So in our building and use tax, for example, if something gets delayed in development, it moves to another year. So we may not receive it in the year that we had projected, but we eventually, unless something catastrophic occurs. So what we would do is move that to a future year and shift that. But we would definitely do a risk, and any lender potentially would do that risk analysis to ensure, and it would not issue a line of credit, if you will, if we did not have that sufficient revenues to support it. So, but we feel pretty confident. Again, it's the same thing if you're looking at our capital improvements plan or our long-range financial plan. We have things programmed in future years, but based on things that occur, take last year, the pandemic occurred, nobody predicted that. We had to shift some capital projects. So in the same regards, if baseline development was delayed, it's not going to impact our overall. We would figure out ways in order to supplement that year, that annual payment. And that's what that reserve fund is also used for. That's established to ensure that should there be any revenue shortfalls, we would have a contingency in place to cover that annual debt service payment.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's all I have.
Okay, Councilmember Schaaf.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So I wanted to go back to something that staff just helped me remember. So Jennifer, Ms. Hoffman, you had made the statement that, with the Civic Center baseline, the redevelopment out at Flatiron Crossing Mall, I believe what you said was we won't make money off of those projects. Did you mean to say that?
Yes, and so let me qualify. Between infrastructure, city services, and the ongoing maintenance, making money, none of these are going to be a cash cow.
Right.
And so it's managing those expectations, because all the upfront costs in order to make the deals work in those first 10 years, Flatirons is a great example. We're not going to see a lot of cheese from Flatirons for probably 12 years. The approach that we're taking, given that we have so much debt from the bond still outstanding, first and foremost, off of the top, we need to be able to make enough to pay for the bond debt and for the continuing infrastructure for the first heavy chunk of the 3 to 5 years. All of those conversations then weigh into the decision-making on the business development agreements. So knowing what you have outstanding and taking that off of the top. So yeah, if we didn't, it's like anything else from a family income perspective. If we didn't have that mortgage payment on Flatirons, then that $6 million would still be in the general fund because we wouldn't be paying for the debt that we refinanced in 2012. That would then influence how much risk we would want to take on and how quickly we would want to invest in the infrastructure for Flatirons. So essentially, what I'm saying is, will there be dollars into the general fund? Yes. Will those general fund dollars be used for the next decade in order to get the project to where it's self-sustaining? Yes. And then by the time we get there, it's time to start all over again. So really, it's paying it. You want it to be a wash or a little better, but having a big windfall is not what any one of these projects is going to do for us.
Great, thank you for that clarification. I mean, you know, not all projects are the same in that, you know, the baseline, the baseline deal, I guess, that we have is going to be different than the Civic Center and the way in which that deal is going to look on the end. So, and I can definitely appreciate that, but you know, there's and I can appreciate the statement of that the goal is to get these to be a wash or slightly better, and I think that that's where we are on it, at least in the initial conversations regarding the Civic Center baseline. It looks like we are going to be even better than that. So, but can appreciate the fact that it's not going to be a major windfall. So I just wanted to clarify that question. I appreciated the question from another council member regarding the rate study and whether this needed to come before we kind of get the independent financing piece. But to that point with the rate study, you know, if we were by going with the independent financing versus the group financing, will one or the other have a higher customer rate on the other end, depending on which decision we made? So would our existing Broomfield residents pay a higher rate, water rate, sewer rate, you know, after we made this decision, regardless of which, either going with the group study or with the independent study?
Councilmember Schaaf, the short answer is no, because regardless of what direction we go in, whether it's going to be group financing or independent debt, we're going to have a long-term obligation. And then as we continue to move forward and look at our operations, our rates will have to adjust to account for increasing costs due to inflation with salaries, cost of treatment chemicals, maintenance, repair, and those types of things. So either, you know, as we look at it from a broader perspective in the long term, there won't be any impacts to the customers other than what we would normally see through increased operation costs.
That's great to hear. I mean, it takes a little bit pressure off this decision. You know, knowing that that's going to be something that happens. The rate study is going to be something that happens after this decision. And then I do have another question. So you had talked about the benefits of the independent financing for Broomfield, and by going this route, there would be some reduced fiscal liability, greater fiscal autonomy, and potential lower costs associated with this. However, while we would be going with the independent financing and not the group financing, if for some reason a partner leaves the partnership or is unable to cover the debt payments, how will that impact Broomfield or the project, knowing that we've already decided and we're going with that independent financing option? How does that still affect us?
So
the default.
Councilmember Schaaf, so really it would depend on whether or not that particular entity was part of the group financing or they had issued their own independent debt. So for example, if it were Longmont who's issuing their own debt, if they default, their remedy is strictly with their bondholders, and it would not impact the project. Conversely, if it was a group financing component, if they were to default, it would be the other entities in the group financing that would first be required to cover that default. So if Broomfield pursues the independent piece, we would have no obligation to help pick that up. However, as you look at the value of water, and if there were an entity that were to get into that position or that situation, I think that there's probably a market out there that you can sell a portion or all of your potential shares to then cure that potential default. But in terms of Broomfield going with the independent financing, we would not have any obligations if others were to default.
And Councilmember Schaaf, when I asked that question with all these water people that were on, they looked at me like I had come from outer space, simply because they refer to it as liquid gold. And there are many communities that would pay a lot more money than we're paying per cubic yard right now to be in this deal. Everyone from Cheyenne to Fort Collins. So defaulting on water is, again, I'm learning about this stuff just every day. It's absolutely fascinating. But the last thing any community defaults on, interestingly enough, even from their services, is water.
All right, so say that a municipality or partner either in that group financing or that independent financing did default on this, and I guess this may be a positive for Broomfield. Would the people within that group or within the partnership of the Windy Gap partnership, would they be on kind of at a higher tier in order to buy that water share or divvy that up amongst those partners? Or would we have to compete against the rest of the world that wants part of this liquid gold?
So Councilmember Schaaf, that's a great question. The way the allotment contract is structured is it's kind of a tiered approach for covering this potential default. So again, if there's a group, if you're in the group, the pooled group, and there's a default, the first step is called a voluntary step up, which means that those that are in the pooled financing can voluntarily step up to cover that default, and as a result, then they're basically first in line to get or to pick up that additional asset along with the additional obligation. Then the next tier would be a mandatory step up, and again, that strictly applies to those that are in the group financing. As you move beyond that, the preference would then be to go first to the other participants to see if they are interested in picking up that. And I believe that there's potentially a kind of a bidding process for that. And then if none of the participants are willing to pick up that default, then at that point it would go to outside entities beyond those that are within the Windy Gap project as a whole.
Okay, that's great to hear. I think that I mean, you know, knowing that how important water is for Broomfield's future, but a lot of other municipalities having that option, I think, is good. But I also think that, you know, for Broomfield to have that option as well would be even better. So I don't know what that would take to in order or be able to have that option kind of available to us when if the time came. But that would be pretty interesting to be able to be in that position with the resources needed.
Thank you. Councilmember Lim.
I just wanted to go a step back from what Councilmember Schaaf was asking. So, you know, when we were referring to the liquid gold and the possibility that we might want to have that option to buy some of these shares later. In planning, I mean, obviously we bought the number of shares that we think we need for build out. So what kind of assumptions were made as far as, you know, sustainability, resiliency in the face of climate change, all of that, that would be in the future, you know, influencing our perspective on the amount of water that we need for the future?
David, just take the methodology.
Yeah, so great question, Councilmember Lim. As part of the planning process, and again, we've had conversations around dynamic modeling and kind of that reassessment approach with looking at how we're planning out our long-term finances and setting ourselves up to be successful in the future. And that's something that we've always continually done on the utility side, particularly as it pertains to the planning for long-term water use. And so as we take a look at the water consumption and those projections that we have, we evaluate those every few years and make adjustments based not only on the planned growth and development that we have, but also taking a look at historic water uses and how those are changing. And one of the things that has been worked actually to our advantage is our implementation of the conservation plan. And what we're seeing is, a gradual reduction in kind of per capita and per residential unit use. Not significant, but when you aggregate it across the entire community, it then does become significant, particularly over time. And so that's something that we're continually looking at. And in terms of the kind of the climate change and the long-term viability of supplies, that's something that all of the large suppliers are looking at and continually evaluating and assessing. Particularly as we look at climate change and how that affects snowpack, which is our primary source of water supply for us here in Broomfield, not only with our CBT and Windy Gap projects, but also our reliance on the Denver water system, which essentially comes from the same mountain snow melt source, but a little bit to the south of where we're getting our other supplies from the northern water. And so those are the things that we're continually looking at. And I think that as we continue to move forward, it's going to be a combination, kind of a multi-pronged approach in terms of continuing to assess this. So it's a combination of adjusting projections, looking at potentially, if we see shortfalls, we may have to implement more aggressive conservation strategies, and then just also planning for additional facilities and infrastructure that may help us bridge gaps when we do have shortages and those types of things.
Okay, thanks for that bigger approach picture.
Are there any other council member comments or questions? Well, City Manager Hoffman, do you want some direction here?
If I'm reading the room correctly, next week we will be bringing back a resolution to move forward seeking independent financing, and then that will be the trigger for RBC and for our bond council to move in that direction.
And we'll bring the debt policy.
Yes.
Okay, seeing no objections. I like this Zoom screen. I'm going to miss this when we go to in-person because you can really get a read on everybody. Maybe there's a way to cheat that. But okay, well, good then. Is there anything else on this topic?
No, Mayor Pro Tem, there is not.
Wow, okay, so we finished that at 7:32. Do we want to take a 10-minute break and then come back and log into the executive session link? Does that sound like a plan? All right, so let's say 7:42. We'll see you back on the other side.
Councilmember Groom, did you?
I'm sorry.
Councilmember Groom had something.
I did. I didn't have any more on the debt. I just was wondering, is there any way we can move up the encampment discussion in June, or is June 29th the earliest we can have that?
Unless council would like to entertain a special meeting, and staff can certainly entertain that. We tried to get it as soon as we could possibly get it, and that's the first feasible date.
Okay.
Thank you. This concludes the agenda items for this evening's study session. Our new time to come back will be 7:43. If there's no further business, it is complete. See you in 10. Thanks, everyone.